Hey everyone, welcome to the podcast. This is your host, Yoshino. And while I was in New York City for the past month, I was able to record a lot of episodes for the podcast, one of which I recorded is with author Mitch Horowitz, who has been on the podcast before, and you may have heard of his work before, but he is a historian of alternative spirituality. He is also the recipient of the PEN Award for Literacy, which is a huge accomplishment within his field. He also writes about topics within esotericism, mysticism, and the occult. And Mitch is one of those rare individuals that is very much true to his word and true to his belief structure. And I know that from personal experience because he's been there for me on multiple occasions, from being in a mastermind group together to just being there whenever I needed him for some advice or just some difficult moments in my life. And he's just someone that I've always been able to count on. And not only is he a brilliant, brilliant author and thinker, but he's just an incredibly, incredibly kind person. And I value Mitch very much. And so I was really glad to be able to share this dialogue with him. A couple of things that we talked about was his upcoming book that is currently unreleased, Modern Occultism. We talked about his concept of the 10-day miracle challenge, and we kind of jumped over into a lot of different subjects, from talking about the teachings of Anton Lavey to G.I. Gurdjieff to talking about films. We talked about some of the TV shows that he's been watching recently, and we talked about various films from Andrei Tarkovsky's Stalker to I brought up The Square and Force Majeure because I really love Ruben Östlund. And yeah, just an exciting episode. We mentioned a lot of different authors in this, where you can find more information about that on our website, artistdecoded.com. So please go check it out there. But before we begin this episode, please go to our iTunes page to leave us a review. Or you can simply go to our Spotify page where you can leave us that 5-star review. It literally only takes 1 minute or probably less than a minute of your time. And that really helps the podcast, and it spreads out the podcast to a group and an audience of listeners, perhaps just like yourself. So as I usually say, the more the merrier. But I'm really excited to share this episode with you. We recorded this in person, which I always love recording episodes in person because you just get the shared energy that you don't really get to exchange when you do a recording or even a conversation on Zoom or just through an audio recording where you don't get to see the person. So yeah, I hope you all like this episode. Again, this is with author Mitch Horowitz, and I hope you enjoy it. Have a great and wonderful day. It's been really good to meet you in person, finally. I mean, we've talked so much.
Yeah.
And I've had you on the podcast multiple times now, but yeah, it's been I don't know, it's been really good, even though this is the second time I've been meeting you in person. But
no, likewise, it's wonderful to be together in 3 dimensions, and we're in my home in Greenpoint in Brooklyn.
Yeah,
and good to have you here.
Yeah, no, thank you, man.
Yeah.
So to start, I want to ask, what are some things that you've been thinking about recently? Certain principles, or even how that relates to the book that you're writing, or certain thoughts that are encompassing your being?
Well, right now I'm finishing up a new book called Modern Occultism, which is a history of the occult from Cleopatra literally up through chaos magic and current modalities. And one of the things I've been thinking about, and this is probably the note on which I'm going to conclude the book, is whether we as a human community, need ritual, ceremony, liturgy, various practices that we sometimes define as magic, or if in understanding that every individual possesses an extra physical component of life, or rather is part of an extra physical component of life, is that knowledge in and of itself enough? Is that sufficient? Because it seems to me that what we're doing in magic and ceremony, even very simple magic like sigil magic, for example, which I participate in, or certain ceremonies or ideas that I've suggested to people, like 10-Day Miracle Challenge and things of that nature, which I'm doing right now, as a matter of fact. But even those things, it seems to me, are devices that are intended to heighten and externalize our will. And what that means precisely is a whole discussion of its own. That gets into theorizing and conceptualizing of how our psyche might interact with the surrounding world or as part of the surrounding world. But in any case, I'm wondering if even simple devices like that can be stripped away. If you know that your psyche has an extra physical component, which I think is beyond question at this point. How it works is a very deep question that I may not live long enough to ever have more than the slightest theoretical threads around, if even that. But that the psyche has an extra physical component, we've seen so much evidence of in testimony and through the scientific method and so on and so forth, that's, I think, a fact a person can stand on. If you know that, then does it follow that ceremony becomes less necessary? So that's something I'm really dwelling with right now.
And okay, so I want to ask about what sort of ceremonies that you suggest for people to partake in, but you said specifically about the 10-Day Miracle Challenge. And for people that don't know what the 10-Day Miracle Challenge is, how did that idea get conjured up, and what is the idea behind that?
Well, it's super simple. One of the tenets of chaos magic, specifically sigil work, is that you're supposed to work your sigil, work your ceremony, and then creatively forget it. You've transferred your passion, you've transferred your wish or your unconscious charging of the matter in question onto the abstract sigil, and you just let it be.
And do you tell people about this after, or is this something that is suggested to keep to yourself?
Well, I think within sigil magic and all magic, people generally advise silence so as not to dilute your intentions or invite in people's bullshit judgments or what have you. Protect us from our friends. And but I dig that paradigm, but I also have experienced frustration with it because I have a very obsessive intellect, and my mind will always go back to the desire. And rather than fight against my nature, I wondered if I could practice magic using my nature. And that's what gave birth to what I call the 10-Day Miracle Challenge. It's really super simple. It just involves writing down a desire, as you might when you're prepping a sigil, but rather than doing a sigil, you create a grid of 10 boxes, and you spend a period of 10 days doing everything that you could possibly think of in terms of magical or personal practice to make an effort towards that aim. So that might involve prayer, affirmations, visualizing, and for that matter, sigil work or any kind of ceremonial magic that you're into, candle magic, chanting, meditating, you name it. And for that matter, also working in an effortful way towards whatever your aim is. Because I thought to myself, I can't believe that Mother Nature would play a cruel joke on us where you can only get the object of your desire if you forget about it. That's sort of like the proposition that's put to us in New Thought that says you can only attain your desire if you enter the feeling state of having attained it. Well, what if a person is in emotional anguish and they can't do that? Or what if a person like me tends toward a more obsessive intellect and they can't do that? Are we just locked outside, Oz? I can't accept that. So I wonder about ways of magic that work with the individual's proclivities rather than ask the individual to change proclivities.
And how would you describe having an obsessive intellect?
I'll just find my mind tracking again and again on the same thing. And that could be very helpful for me as a historian, for example. I can't tell you the number of times that I've woken up at 4 o'clock in the morning and say, did I fuck something up? Did I get something wrong? And 20% of the time I'm correct. And I go back to an area of the book I was working on or the article, and I do catch an error and I do make corrections. People always say, chill out, relax, go with the flow. And I kind of like raise my eyebrows at that. Like, why is that necessary? Do you want your surgeon to chill out? Do you want your, do you want your nurse practitioner to chill out? Don't you want that person to care very deeply about whether they're giving you the correct dosing, or the pilot in your plane to really give a shit about being up on aviation safety? And so, I mean, to everything its moment, there may be times and places where chilling out is desirable. For me as a writer, I don't find it desirable. I work very hard so that my reader has the best experience possible. But it's difficult to turn that off. So my brain is always going. And, sometimes that can be a help, sometimes that can be a barrier. But where it's a barrier, rather than try to change something intrinsic that may be intrinsic to my nature, why not work with it?
So speaking of that intrinsic nature, is that something that you've always had your entire life, this obsessive intellect? Or do you think that by channeling into you becoming a writer as a career, that became more tapped into? Because you started or not started writing, but your first book was published in your early 40s.
Mm-hmm. All right, 43, yeah.
43.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I always had, it was funny, Yoshino, like lifelong I've struggled with anxiety. And when I started writing, I returned to writing probably around age 36, and then my first book appeared at age 43.
But were you writing your whole life up until?
No, I was a big hiatus. I was writing when I got out of college. I was working in journalism, and I was unhappy with it. Then I stopped. I went into publishing for a long stretch, and that stretch in publishing, it had its satisfactions, but there was a sorrow there too, because I wasn't writing, and I was pretty good at making excuses for why I wasn't doing the thing itself, and my friends were pretty good at reassuring me, "Oh no, you're exactly where you ought to be." But I knew something was arterially missing, and then I went back to writing.
Okay, so that's a really interesting thing that you brought up, and I definitely want to go back to what we're talking about like the obsessive intellect. That's what you said, right? The obsessive intellect.
And that anxiety or whatever it was I felt,
mm-hmm.
which I've wrestled with lifelong. When I started writing, I don't know, I've never really thought of it this way before, but maybe that gave it that anxiousness, that intellectual buzzing, a more proper channel, because I juggle vast amounts of info in my head as best as I'm capable. And that, to me, if it results in a good book or a good article or a good talk, that's a positive means of directing that energy.
Yeah.
So I haven't changed so much as I've irrigated it somewhere else.
You've like redirected, or you've channeled into that proclivity.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. And so I guess where I was going with that in terms of being on the hiatus of writing. So for instance, I mean, I'm sure that all of us have certain examples of friends or ourselves that put their passions on the back end in order to pursue something that they think may be more lucrative or directly lucrative.
Yeah.
And so now that you have fully embraced yourself as a writer and are constantly getting affirmations because, people want to give you publishing deals and so on and so forth, looking in hindsight, like what would you tell that younger version of yourself that was in publishing?
I probably would have stuck with it, to be frank with you, because although I was not happy in publishing, it was remunerative and it helped me to put away and save a lot of money. There was a time and a place for pursuing a more stable career, a more stable life. I'm very cautious about encouraging myself or anyone else to think in terms of undoing a decision, because something that we might not want to go through again has nonetheless proven refining. I think publishing as a field, for example, is very uninspiring. But if I met a young person who wanted to go into publishing, and that is what he or she really wanted to do, I would encourage that person, because maybe that's the individual who would fix the whole thing, or maybe that's the individual who would function at the upper echelon of 10% of editors who are really kicking ass and doing a good job, as opposed to the apathy that I think abounds in the industry. So I would never discourage anybody from doing it, and I wouldn't even discourage my younger self from doing it. It brought me a lot of stability at a time in life where I needed it.
Definitely, yeah. And I think it can be very toxic to one's own psyche to want to undo the past, because the past and those decisions, you were there at a particular part of your life. You made that decision, and I think it's more so probably behooves us to find some sort of semblance, or find some sort of comfort in knowing that that was us at that time, and we've moved on, and it has helped us become the person that we are today.
Yeah,
is what I'm trying to say.
And it also, it was, for me, at least personally speaking, it was boot camp for writing. I remember there was one season where I was working on 17 books. Some of them were reprints, some of them were anthologies or reissues, and some were originals. But I was working on 17 books. And I said to our production manager at the time, I can't do it. I can't do it. And she said to me, you can and you will. And, knowing that I could sit down and back-to-back write 17 pieces of pretty good catalog copies, 17 pieces of pretty good back ad or flap copies, 17 presentations to sales agents who have to sell these books. It was doable. It proved doable. So my friend was right. And that helped me. Writing does take time, and there's no way around that. It does take time for it to be of quality. But that did give me the training to write good and serviceable copy under the gun of a very serious time limit.
I can see how that can help you in terms of your work ethic and establishing a certain work ethic within yourself. And I think that what I think about in terms of past situations is trying to understand, at least for me, and I'm curious what you think about this, is that your life can be this holistic process or this holistic system in which the decisions you made throughout your life are additive, as long as you have the perspective in which that in which it is additive, as opposed to something that detracts from the person that you want to be.
Absolutely. And I would also say that if people have things in their past that they might look back regretfully on or ruefully, I would say, first of all, again, that suffering may have served a refining process that produced the most mature parts of you, the parts of you that you're most proud of. I would also say that you don't have to dwell in it either. You don't have to tell somebody where you grew up. You don't have to tell somebody where you went to school. You don't have to tell somebody what your sexuality was. You don't have to tell, it's nobody's fucking business if you are not interested in sharing it. And I'm always very careful to note that people of a certain age sometimes will talk about their past, and it's clear that there's some point about themselves that they want to get across, and that's okay. But the individual does not have to do that. And I suspect there are probably ways for all of us, and this solution is private for everybody, but there are probably ways, without being a total asshole or being rude, just not talk about that aspect of your past. Or, if you're Carlos Castaneda, just fucking make it up. I mean, I really, the answer to that is private for every individual. I don't make shit up personally, but I won't talk about parts of my past that I don't feel like, if I feel that it's not pertinent to a situation.
Mm-hmm. Well, also, I think that when people talk about certain situations of their past, it's, that they're trying to work through it, and they're trying to find some sort of feedback from those situations, right? But I think that, we are such social creatures that sometimes you need that feedback, but also presenting those ideas to an audience of people. I'm not speaking specifically about this audience, right? But just to a friend as an audience, it could be, an audience could be anyone, right? That it could be positive or negative depending on your perspective at the time and also the other person's projections of what they've been through, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's very important to understand the intention for why you bring certain things up, although that's not always the case.
No. And,
You know what I mean?
and I would also
Yeah.
say to people that it could be a very tricky and very frustrating gambit to try to get other people to acknowledge or share your perceptions of the past. In one sense, it's very important because all of us want to be seen, and it's a terrible suffering to not be seen. It's a terrible suffering to not be acknowledged.
I agree.
And
I agree.
sometimes people will go to a sibling or a parent or an ex and want that person to share, want that person to sort of stand in judgment for or acknowledge past abuses or things like that. And I understand that impulse 100%. But what people frequently find in that situation is terrible frustration, and they get injured twice because other people don't have or will not concede to the same memories of the past as us. Emotions form memories. The stuff that we tend to remember, especially on a personal scale, is of an emotional nature. And another individual who didn't go through those same emotions will not have the same recollections, inevitably, of the past, and they won't be willing to give you that which you're looking for. It took me decades to learn that. And sometimes people simply will not concede past actions, like somebody who's been abusive, for example. None of us see ourselves as abusers. None of us see ourselves as bullies. Nobody sees him or herself as the bad guy. We all think that our motives are as pure as the freshly fallen snow. And if we were brought face to face with a contradiction to that, we would not let it in. We literally simply don't permit the impression to penetrate. So that's the thing about the past. It does require resolution, but that resolution rarely, I would say, comes from someone else sharing and acknowledging past perceptions. It's ours.
Mm-hmm. Unless it's spoken at the right time when you're ready to hear it.
It can happen. I've witnessed events where the crack in a facade was just enough so that something spoken at the right time, if it was spoken, could have made a difference.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so kind of going back to what you've been writing recently with modern occultism, I mean, I know you can't share a lot of the book, or I'm curious what you can share, but
sure,
I guess what are some things, kind of going back to my first question, but what are some understandings or new insights or something that is very interesting that you've been learning recently?
Well, I have visited and revisited the lives of certain figures who maybe in the past I didn't see as having led lives that would be instructive to me, and I found things within their lives that are instructive. That includes Aleister Crowley, that includes Jack Parsons, who I came into a whole new conception of, and I think he was a beautiful, beautiful man. And whatever it was that Jack suffered, and whatever it was that triggered Jack's death, there's consequences and catastrophes that fall into every life. But I think he led a life of tremendous integrity and intellectual greatness. And I am writing about figures who are not often viewed heroically, like Anton Lavey, the founder of the Church of Satan, who I think also, although I don't always share every aspect of Anton's emphasis or aesthetics or speaking style, I do think that he swept into the scene at a very important time and helped strip people of illusions about what they were really looking for on the spiritual path, and was very willing to speak bluntly and insistently about success in outer life as not only a predicate, but a hand-in-hand co-accomplishment to success in the search, that the individual needed to be able to demonstrate competency in those ways that the world requires before we could start to successfully peer beyond what it is that the world presents to us. And
can you be more specific on that? Like,
well, he was he was I'm writing a section about Anton right now. He would not put up with any indirectness, and he would not put up with any dishonesty. There's things that we all want in life that we have been conditioned, especially by spiritual and sometimes by therapeutic philosophies, to disabuse ourselves of, or devalue, or try to persuade ourselves. Money can't make you happy. Success can't make you happy. Sex can't make you happy. So forth and so on. How does the individual know that? Has the individual attained those things prior to renouncing them? Or is there some further step to go where, to speak authoritatively, to speak authentically, the individual needs to attain those things to realize whether or not they make him or her happy? I'm age 57. I wouldn't be happy right now if I hadn't started writing, if I never went back to writing and I had proven a success in publishing. We wouldn't even be having this conversation. I would be very unhappy. And Anton forced people to get down to brass tacks, to be honest, to be frank, to drop facades. And he used novelty to do that. The Satan's horns and the shaved head and the cape and all that. Gurdjieff said we need to imbibe truth in the form of a lie in order to accept it, because we're not able to accept truth on its own terms, because it violates our precious sense of self. And I would say Anton abided that. He used a theatricality to crack open people's shells, and he used facade to destroy facade, and that was his greatness. And I'm also looking at figures like William Burroughs and Brian Geisen, and I was delighted to find, as I think I've shared with you previously, that Burroughs and Geisen were dedicated readers of Napoleon Hill's Think and Grow Rich, this self-help book that we all think is so safe and familiar and domesticated, and they found wild ideas in it that they explored in their book, The Third Mind. So I was very turned on by that.
Yeah. No, definitely. Well, so can you go back to what you said that Gurdjieff said about the lie?
The truth has to come in the form of a lie, in the sense that we as humans are so broken and so in love with ourselves, apropos of what I was saying earlier about no one ever perceiving him or herself as a bully, as a bad guy, as a predatory figure, as an aggressor, what have you. We're so in love with ourselves that we won't accept tough truths about ourselves or the state of human nature in general if it's put to us directly. It'll be denied. And whomever offers it will be stoned to death on Twitter, or metaphorically or otherwise. And so hence truth has to come to us somehow disguised, clothed or cloaked in something else. I guess you could say for the figure of Christ, that was in parables. For the figure of Anton Lavey, that was in a certain theatricality. There might be other ways of bringing people to these places where a facade gets cracked open. There's a spiritual teacher I like very much named Vernon Howard, who died in 1992. And Vernon would say things that people would immediately want to argue with, but if only they lived with them. And Vernon would say things like, you show me the victim and I'll show you the bully. And immediately, of course, one wants to argue with that. That's not fair. That's not right. There are victims. But his deeper point was that we all perceive ourselves that way. We all perceive ourselves as someone defrauded me, someone hurt me, and therefore, I'm always right. And if you could live with one of those statements, they're almost koans. You live with it for 6 months. Just live with it for 6 months. It can mean something.
Yeah, I understand. Well, also, I think that time and a massive amount of introspection will give you the teaching that you actually need. So if you think of yourself as a victim in a particular situation, you can actually change that understanding, or what you believe to be an understanding, to something that's much more transformative for the psyche, right?
I think it's certainly possible, and there may be outer changes as well that help a person. And I think we have to be frank about that. I think we really have to be frank about that. There was a woman who wrote to me not long ago, and this is a heavy statement, and this is going to press buttons.
Okay.
And I'm definitely not saying it to press buttons. I mean, I don't provoke as an end to itself. But I think she read something I wrote about the imperative of getting away from cruel people. And I really mean it, And it's not just a way of framing things. I believe it's critically important to the individual's life and well-being to get away from cruelty. Yeah. And she wrote to me and said, my mother was very cruel to me. She was a bully. She diminished me. It was horrible. I couldn't shake it even into adulthood with all the therapy in the world. And she said, my mother died about 2 years ago, and I've never been happier, and there's not a day where I'm not glad she's gone. And I wrote back to her and I said, bravo for sharing that. Bravo for being frank about that. And think about the therapeutic and the ethical philosophies that would take that away from that person. Think of all the guardians of mental health and of ethical rightness who would line up to snatch that insight away from that woman. Oh, no, you need closure, you need emotional resolve, you should have gone to her before she died. These are all the nostrums that we spend decades telling ourselves without verification.
Totally.
Is that true? She had an experience. Her mother died. It's 2 years hence. And she's feeling a tremendous flood of relief. And I could tell from how she wrote to me, her sincerity. There was no over-explaining. There was no embarrassment. There was no self-justification. Just very straightforward. And I thought it was beautiful. So for that woman, the suffering that she endured had ended, and she was glad. And I'm first in line to shake hands with her.
Well, I think, and I agree with you, I think that truth, or having a sense of a personal truth, you have to be very frank, and you have to be incredibly, incredibly honest. Like, that's something that I've gotten from our mastermind talks, especially early on, is to be very, very, actually, your honesty during those talks was actually kind of polarizing to me in a good way, in the sense that it made me realize like how much of the facade of myself that I was trying to break, which brought me to the conclusion of absolute honesty with the self. And I think that because we're such social creatures, we try to relay our ideas to people that we trust, whether that be a therapist or whether that be a parental figure or a parent or a friend, but those people all have their own sense of reality and their own baggage towards different subjects. And I think we need to be very frank and very honest about specifically like what we need to transform ourselves.
Yes.
So for that person, that person, it sounds like they needed to be very honest and say that, I'm glad that my mom died.
It's shocking, right? And
it's shocking, but I've heard that before from one other person, actually.
That's remarkable.
Yeah.
Because everything in our culture tries to take that away from us. We're constantly sold on a set. Basically, there's 20 revolving, if I may pull a figure out of the air, there's 20 or so revolving therapeutic, popular, ethical ideas that
people cut and paste.
They cut and paste, and we're refed them again and again and again. Even if they don't satisfy your appetite, that's what's on the menu, and that's what you're being given. And so the notion that you have to make peace with your past, that you have to change yourself, you can't change other people, et cetera, and all these things in a given time and place, they may have application and they may be valuable. But they're not necessarily valuable in every time and place, and yet it's a very limited menu. And I want the individual to think very freely about what might make him or her happy. And again, if somebody comes along and tells you money won't make you happy, well, how do they know? Do they have money? And if they do have money, would they give it up? And
money. Yeah, exactly. And to your
find
point,
out. Find out. Now, you may not be able to find out, but wouldn't it be tragic to never even try, to just decide that because you read it in a fortune cookie somewhere, it must be true that such and such can't make you happy? I would follow that and find out.
Well, I take all my advice from fortune cookies.
Right,
I mean,
exactly.
that's my rule of thumb.
Probably better than like most of our sources.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not going to listen to my therapist. I'm just like,
right.
but what about that fortune cookie that had the numbers on the back that became my lucky numbers?
Probably an equal bet, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
I have nothing against therapy. You know, I'm just trying to say I want people to think freely. You know,
For sure.
yeah.
I think being too by the book on everything, that's actually what I've realized. It's something that's really interesting, and I always come back to this film, The Square. Have you seen The Square?
I haven't.
I've mentioned this movie so many times, and I just keep on thinking about it because have you seen Force Majeure? The film Force Majeure?
I am dying to see Force Majeure, and I keep putting it off.
So this filmmaker, he's brilliant, Ruben Östlund, and he does such an interesting job about breaking down like social situations and bullshit and human dynamics and how that all like intermingles and coalesces in this very comedic way. And in his films, he's always breaking down these social situations and finding the comedic elements in it, such as in The Square, it's about a museum, and in the beginning of the film, there's like this real bullshit statement and the of what the exhibit is about, and I mean, you could basically see that at any museum, right? And the museum exhibit is called Mirrors and Piles of Gravel. And it's literally that. It's mirrors stuck in piles of gravel.
Right.
and it's obviously supposed to be like farcical, right? But and then in Force Majeure, the situation is about a husband and wife, and I believe they have 2 kids. They go on vacation in some ski resort, and this is Ruben Östlund is a Swedish director, so I'm assuming it's somewhere in Sweden. And so basically what happens in the first act of the film is that they're outside at lunch at the ski resort, and in the far distance they see this avalanche starting to form, and everyone like looks over and they think it's so beautiful, but then it starts to come closer and closer and closer. And then so what happens is the husband, he grabs his phone and runs off and leaves his wife and two kids there, right? So that's where the drama starts to build. Wow. And the tension of the story starts to build. And so the way that Ruben Östlund paints these pictures is like, what would you do in a situation where things go wrong? How do you react animalistically to these things? And how does that differ from the constructs in which we believe in, or the guidelines and the principles and morals, right? We were talking about morals earlier, about of how we structure our belief systems, right? And I think that his films are fucking brilliant.
I want to see both. And
you have to see both.
I've been thinking about Force Majeure for 3 years without ever having seen it.
You have to.
I think there was a remake made of it recently, wasn't there?
I think there was, but
or maybe it's coming.
I think it might be coming, or there was, but there's something about Swedish kind of comedies that I don't know. I feel like well, I don't know. Maybe it's just specifically Ruben Östlund.
I'm eager to see it. I'm really eager to see it. I'm always touched by films that don't answer our moral quandaries for us either. And the movie that had one of the greatest effects on me in this respect was Stalker, which is a Russian science fiction film, a Soviet-era science fiction film from the 70s based on a novel called Roadside Picnic. And I've written about Stalker before, and the basic pivot point of the movie is that there is this wasteland where aliens had landed and departed, and nobody's sure what they were doing there, but they left behind space junk that nobody knows quite how to use. And one of the things that got left behind is a structure which in the movie is called the room, and in the book, in the novel, is called the wish machine. And people want to enter this cordoned off zone so that they could go into the room or make contact with the wish machine and have their heart's desires granted them. But what they don't realize is that the wish machine will grant what you really want versus what you say you want. So it brutally strips away hypocrisy, kind of like what we've been talking about. And for those protagonists who enter the room, if they survive getting into this forbidden zone, enter the room, they've got unbearable suffering in store if they don't know what they really want, because they're going to be granted it. And so I think the director Tarkovsky and the novelists, Stugatsky brothers, were indicating to the audience member that you better know who you really are, because your emotions and your passions are going to rule the day. And one way or another, you're going to get some variant of what you want, barring some extraordinary countervailing measure. And what you want is coming one way or the other. So it's going to be hell for you if you don't know what that really is. So time to throw out the rule books and the nostrums and the bullshit and get down to the business, like it or not, of knowing what you really want. So that ties back to what I was saying about Anton Lavey and some of the other figures whose lives I'm considering in modern occultism. I think that breaking through that facade, it might be the most important moment of a person's life.
Definitely. And I think that's where true transformation for that individual can occur if someone is very frank about their intentions for things outside of social constructs as much as you can be, right? I mean, I think we have to abide by them to certain respects, even if, I mean, you know, a lot of people draw out that notion of like going to the deserted island and right. But I don't know exactly how realistic that would be, but
I've always failed when I've tried to isolate myself when writing. You know, people have this dream of the deserted island or the cabin in the woods, and there they'll write their symphony or they'll do their book. And what you'll do is you'll drink a lot and you'll get addicted to drugs. You'll binge watch because you'll be lonely and you only have a few hours of.
Or you have an Antichrist scenario,
right?
Like we were talking about the other day,
right? You only have a few hours of quality work in you in the space of a day. Maybe you can meditate, recharge, nap, but those situations can be very lonely and desperate. So, well, listen, to each his own. If somebody does it and it works out for them, great. Yeah. But I'd be real careful.
But I mean, you know, that like, let's extrapolate on, or like, let me think about this idea. So it's like, I think that people romanticize that idea of being in isolation because there is so much information coming at us from all different avenues, right? From social media to blah, 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 right? And so I think the idea of being isolated by yourself with your own thoughts is very attractive to a lot of people because there's just too much coming at you and your brain cannot adapt to that.
It's possible. You know, it's funny. One of the things I'm writing about apropos of Anton Lavey is that he talked about something called the Augmentive Principle. And he said that because we can only absorb so much media and so much information, he said, if you can clarify what it is that you're really interested in and what it is you really care about, you should be exclusive in terms of intake of media and information to things that augment and build that quality subject area that you really care about. And don't feel any anxiety about blocking out anything else because we're overwhelmed. And he was writing this in the pre-digital era. Imagine how much heavier this is today. We're overwhelmed with media intake and other things that people are pushing on us. And he said the individual should feel very much at liberty. In fact, it's necessary to restrict your media intake only to those things that are going to augment what you really care about. Emerson wrote about that too, just following your passions and not feeling that you owe anybody else your eyes or ears.
Mm-hmm. And with that principle in mind, how do you think that you do that with your life?
I rarely watch any videos that anybody sends me. I have no interest in cats playing the piano or people falling downstairs or whatever it is that people are forcing me to watch.
So you're telling me to stop sending these videos. Right. I'm like, you did not get my 100
the busload of nuns going off the
no. Yeah, you did not get. Yeah, no, exactly.
No. I mean,
that's a great video.
I will take recommendations from people I love and care about, of course.
I'm just messing with you.
But I'll and sometimes my head does get cracked open watching something that I might not otherwise be inclined to watch, which is really cool. But I definitely, there are times where I've gone 2 years without seeing much of the way of current movies or television or anything of that nature, just because I've been pounding away at deadlines and I don't have time for it. And then once in a while, I'll carry with me like force majeure in my pocket for 3 years, and who knows, maybe I'll watch it tonight. Or I'll watch something that I just enjoy because I like the premise. Right now, I'm on season 3 of a streaming show called The Last Ship, which is about a pandemic wipes out the world. Thank God that could never happen. And there's one naval ship left that has to go around helping everybody. And I love it because it's neat. It's what I need. Shit blows up every 15 seconds. And it's really hard for me to relax. And that show gives me that outlet. And so I will just be purposely fickle, sometimes, and say, fuck it. I'm going to watch whatever I want. I just don't want to be, challenged in any way. I just like the premise of this thing and I'm going for it. And I will of course read things with great care that I feel have something to impart to me. And they might be very, very far off the mark from what people would imagine. They may be things that don't visibly relate to occultism or practical spirituality at all, but just a story that I think captures some facet of human nature that I want to explore.
Have you read Station 11?
No, what is that?
It's essentially a very similar premise to The Last Ship. Mm-hmm. Is that what the name of the show is?
Yes.
The Last Ship. In the sense where a pandemic has happened and it taken out the whole world.
I love escapism.
Yeah. No, but it's brilliant. It's brilliantly written. It's written by Emily St. John Mandel. And basically it's this group of artists, from dancers, musicians, that travel around, I guess, the United States or wherever, and they go to these different places where people have, like, these different cities where people are still alive, and they perform in front of them.
Oh.
And so, but I mean, it definitely goes way deeper because it, talks about the backstory and kind of draws everything out in that sense.
I'll have to watch it. I seem to be on a kick of watching virus wipe out the world shows. I just watched The Last of Us, which I enjoyed immensely. And my partner,
I really want to watch it.
Oh, it's quite good. It's actually the best zombie series I've ever seen, best zombie flick I've ever seen. And my partner, Jacqueline Castel, can't fathom, like why after our emergence from a worldwide pandemic, I'm watching all these shows as if like, well, thank God that could never happen. And anyway, in any case, for whatever reason, the worldwide pandemic, maybe it was this global precognition or something, I don't know. Yeah. Hopefully it's over. Seems to be the vessel with which we're vesting our fears right now. I guess in the Twilight Zone era of the 1950s, the vessel was the monster next door, or the prospect of nuclear war, or Cold War paranoia. And today's vessel is the possibility that just everything could be upended at any moment because of a natural unfolding that none of us can do anything about. There's this tremendous existential dread. Maybe it's always been there, but it's certainly heightened today if you measure it by how that's become a template for some of our most popular entertainment.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you bring that up, and I never thought about it in that capacity because, if you think about The Walking Dead and all these serial killer shows, and there's a certain amount of existential dread that I think is embedded in shows that are that destructive to humanity, or like the aftermath of that, right?
Yeah.
Maybe not so much in the serial killer shows, but I think like pandemic oriented shows or like Walking Dead zombie oriented shows, this post-apocalyptic future world. That
What's funny is in these shows, it seems to me there's both a fear and a wish. And we're always told that, and this is in the Kybalion, everything is part of a continuum. Everything is part of a polarity, whether it be love, hate, courage, fear, joy, misery. There's a kind of polarity to all that is. And it's easier for me nowadays to understand how a wish and a fear can be one and the same. The fear is obviously the loss of everything that's familiar, and the world that we know gets completely pulled out from under us. But there's a wish in that too, because it liberates people from the desperation of their lives. It's no more worrying about layoffs, no more worrying about making your insurance payments, no more having to be put on hold on customer service, no more wondering about whether the airbags in your car are subject to recall. Those boring, grinding aspects of life are completely wiped out. It's both a fear and a wish.
It's interesting that you say that, because I've been watching this show called Alone. Have you ever heard of this show?
No.
It's essentially where there are a group of people that get chosen to be on this show. And for instance, one season they're in the Antarctic, and they basically have to survive by themselves in the Antarctic.
Is this an unscripted show, like a reality show, or it's a drama?
It's an unscripted show.
Oh,
And but basically, they have a lifeline the whole time where they could, call and basically tap out. And it's for me, it's a interestingly cathartic, like kind of a show. And I think it's so popular because of the things that we're talking about that sort of like post-apocalyptic society sort of a thing, or having to fend for yourself out in the wild. And I think there's a certain personality type that is very interested in that.
Yeah.
And that sort of idea or romanticization of the idea can be tickled a little bit with that show.
That's interesting. We never know, of course, how any of us are going to do under these conditions, and that's why it's so. I mean, one of the things I found during my search is that I was involved in the Gurdjieff work for about 8 years, and I valued it enormously. And one of the things that occurred in that work is that people would be placed into situations that I would be placed into situations that were unfamiliar and inconvenient. And it was remarkable to see how quickly it became difficult to manage in those situations that are unfamiliar, and by no means difficult on any scale that deserves that word. Nobody was physically unsafe. You didn't have bombs falling around you. You're not isolated. You might be having to prepare a very involved meal during a winter camping trip or something like that. It's difficult. You're waking up in unfamiliar surroundings. Maybe you're not getting enough sleep according to conventional standards. And it's very, very important to experience yourself, observe yourself in those settings. And it's one of the great gifts, one of the great, great gifts brought by that work is that it pierces fantasy. I guess it's not much different from what we were talking about earlier in terms of facade. It pierces fantasy. And people who get attracted to organizations like that, dedicated to the search, of which there are very, very, very few, are often the wise owls in their own setting of life, their workplace, their home, whatever. They're the wise owls. They're widely read. And they come in ready to be seated at the partner's table, and if they're intelligent, what they find is that those things are shattered very, very quickly, and it's enormously valuable because we walk around with these inflated estimates of ourselves, again, unverified, untested. How do I know what I would do in isolation? How do I know what I did I do well in the woods with the snow when I, had to make a meal? Well, let's talk about that. Let's be frank about that. What would it be if you took that many, many steps further, and it's really important to realize that you don't know a person unless you see them having to change a flat tire. Not a big deal, but most people would fall apart under those circumstances, would get hysterical under those circumstances. And the same thing for so-called good people. You know, I've had people attack me because they think that I'm attached to something spiritually that they associate with their conception of the dark side or whatever. Well, you know, my philosophy is if you were on the side of a road with a car in a flat tire with no cell reception and there was one car coming that you had a chance to flag down, who would you want to see behind the wheel? And if it's me, okay, good. There's something about my philosophy that's okay. You know, or would it be somebody who throws rocks at people and wants to condemn people for not having the reassuring reference points on the spiritual path that they ought to? But we must, or we're fakes, think in terms of changing that flat tire or being alone on that road. And don't just think in those terms, but if you're ever in such a situation, try to observe. It may not come again. Our lives are very cushy, very easy. We're terribly coddling of ourselves, and the world is terribly coddling of us. And so we can't know ourselves.
Yeah. And I think that's why it's very important to be cognizant of that, but not even just be cognizant of that, but to test ourselves, whether that's physically or mentally or, you know, a mixture of the two. But I think that the society in which we live in promotes comfortability.
Yeah.
As opposed to, like everything is about comfortability, like whether it's like getting your Amazon package so you don't have to go down to the grocery store to get that
right
tiki cup.
Right,
or,
exactly. We're drinking coffee out of tiki cups for anybody who's wondering.
Yeah, exactly. But, which sounded like...
these are Jacqueline's. I just took them.
I mean, they're great. They're great. Nothing against a tiki cup.
Yeah.
More so about the
things are super easy, and of course we're disconnected from supply chains.
Yeah.
And Gurdjieff used to say, and this goes back generations prior to at-home shopping and screens and digital life and so forth. He used to say that if a person looks at a chair, he or she ought to have some awareness of where that chair came from. It had to be, the wood had to be harvested. If there are steel bolts in it, the steel, had to be mined from the earth and shaped in a refinery somewhere. Somebody had to paint it. Somebody had to varnish it. So, somebody's breathing in those fumes. Just be aware. Just be aware. Where does this chair come from? And that's something obviously that's missing from my life.
And so what specifically brought you to Gurdjieff's work? I mean, we were talking about earlier about emotions and memory. And I mean, obviously there are certain teachers along the way that you've read these books of that really leave a huge impression. Napoleon Hill, Gurdjieff, Emerson. I mean, you would be able to name it.
I got attracted to Gurdjieff, as I frequently do to a spiritual figure, due to my perception of the gravity of him as a person. His personal gravitas is what attracted me. And that drew me in. I felt there was a depth of seriousness there. It's interesting. You can take two people and have both of those two people say the same thing. And from one person, the statement means nothing. It's just a bromide. But from the other person, it's really meaningful because of the personal gravity that he or she possesses. And so when Gurdjieff would make a statement, I took that statement with the deepest seriousness. And I write about this in Daydream Believer because he talked about a formula that I relate to, this so-called wish machine or the room in Stalker. And he talked about how effort, intense effort, super effort, brings with it a reaction, a response that is lawful, that will bring you to something that you need. And of course, another person could just say, oh, sure, well, persistence matters. And it's nothing. That's just an empty slogan. But when Gurdjieff says it comes from a fuller place. And when he speaks of it as being lawful, it means something far greater. And there was the gravity of the person and of what he had passed through. and his life and of trying to rescue people, his students, as refugees from Russia with no sentimentality whatsoever. I mean, they were fleeing the Russian Revolution simply because in his circle of students there was a lot of so-called white Russians, and they were physically in danger of losing their lives. So they had to escape with no money across Eurasia, and the travails that they went through were hard to believe. But some of them did survive. And so when he would speak of something as being lawful, it meant something. So there was the force of character that I think attracted me to the figure.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, there's just certain teachers along the way, whether that's through books or, people that you actually encounter in the flesh, that make such a huge impression on you. And yeah, I was just curious about that.
Yeah, and it's certainly not true for every teacher. I mean, I value Think and Grow Rich as a book enormously. Napoleon Hill is almost the opposite to me. I think he was a man pockmarked with failures and ethical ugliness and things that I find objectionable. And I have a piece that I've written about him called The Enigma of Napoleon Hill, which is up on Medium. I'll later be anthologizing it in a book, and I write as forthrightly as I possibly can about the value that I think emerged from his program and the deep, deep misgivings I have about him as an individual.
What do you think about that idea? And this idea has come up a lot, separating the art from the artist.
I'm not sure about it, frankly. I have known some people whose character I find so corrupt and unappealing that I honestly believe they have nothing of worth to offer the world. And their art, their statements mean almost nothing to me, especially in the area of ethical or spiritual or therapeutic philosophy. My feeling is if a person can't demonstrate some reasonable degree of truth-telling, solidarity, loyalty, keeping of his or her word, don't write anything of an ethical nature. It's all just conjecture and jargon. Maybe that's specific to philosophy. I'm not sure, but I have met some people, having worked in publishing for a long time, who are so corrupt as individuals that I'm frankly convinced they have nothing to offer the world. I do also recognize that some people can change as they get older. It's certainly not common, but it's not unknown, and there may be a kind of ideal or a model of life that they move toward in a fuller direction as they age. I'm not really sure. Napoleon Hill's a very tough case for me because I recommend his book. I read his book very closely. I've written many things based on his book, and I believe in the efficacy of his book. I would recommend it freely to anybody. At the same time, I have to be frank with myself and my readers that there are episodes of con artistry in this man's career which I detest. There are episodes of toadyism to people in power which I detest. He covered up a crime in which a black bellhop was accidentally killed in the early 20th century, which I detest. And I can't avoid frankness about these things. I also know, having read his book multiple times and worked with it very closely, that its formulas work. That's been my personal experience. This article that I wrote about him, I think, lays bare, very frankly, everything that I've been describing and tries to come to grips with it. Because it is an enigma for me. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you very eloquently put that. Yeah, I think I'm with you on that in terms of it being like a case-by-case scenario, and there's a lot of nuance and details to certain people's lives, which warrants more of a discussion as opposed to painting it black and white. And actually, that's probably for most things, is to never paint things as like totally negative or totally positive. I think that there's a lot of details under the folds that one has to, doesn't have to, but could warrant a good conversation about.
And there are lots of such things. I've spoken just now of my deep admiration and respect for the figure of Gurdjieff. Now, one of Gurdjieff's greatest students was a man named P.D. Uspensky, and he wrote a book about Gurdjieff's teaching called In Search of the Miraculous, which
I actually think I read one of a short book that he wrote about tarot.
Oh, yes, his book, The Tarot. That was taken from a longer book that Uspensky wrote. Maybe it was Tertium Organum. Uspensky was a brilliant mathematician and a philosopher with interest in the esoteric and the occult. And his documentation of his time with Gurdjieff in Search of the Miraculous I recommend it to everybody. Now, Uspensky later broke with Gurdjieff, and everybody asked the question of why? Why did Uspensky break with Gurdjieff? Well, I think that when that question is asked, people are sometimes looking away from Uspensky's most obvious statement on the matter, which falls toward the end of In Search of the Miraculous, where he describes an episode where this group of so-called white Russians was attempting to escape revolutionary Russia, and they needed to for their lives. It was very, very dangerous times. And they were facing military checkpoints and all kinds of things that were harrowing. And Uspensky wrote that there was a point at which Gurdjieff, for reasons that were really not at all clear to him, sent two or more members of their party back home to Russia. And Uspensky felt that Gurdjieff was almost certainly sending these people to their death because the journey was just too harrowing. And he could see no productive reason for Gurdjieff having done that. And he leaves it there. He makes that statement and he leaves it there. And he felt very, very deeply disapproving of that. Now, there are lots of people who would line up to say, oh, he didn't understand and there was a deeper meaning and you can't always register what a realized man is doing. I reject that because I think that the sensitive individual, especially at moments of a deep and exquisite sensitivity, which all mature people have from time to time, is capable of viewing and sizing up a situation, even if he or she might revert to something lesser or coarser thereafter. We're not all walking around with these states of great clarity, but there may be moments, especially moments of crisis, where we do experience clarity, and I think it is owed to somebody of Uspensky's intellect to honor that observation. And I do. And I don't know why Gurdjieff would have done that. I have no idea. The author who was there in the flesh had no idea. And it's very, very difficult to read people's characters. There's also tremendous inconsistency in people's characters.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think it's really easy for us to judge situations or stories for face value, but there's a lot more details that we don't know because we weren't there.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think, it's just more complicated.
It's very complicated and it's confounding. Look, there are people who are close to us that do weird things and it's hard to understand. And sometimes people are left asking
things that are completely out of character that you would think.
You would think. It's very confounding. It's very confounding. Mm-hmm. What makes a person feel safe? When does a person feel entitled or threatened or what have you? I mean, look, what happens is in marriage, people will look back and say, why did I marry this person? How did this occur?
Of course.
It didn't happen all at once. It's very confounding. Human nature is enormously difficult.
Okay, so I'm curious what you think about this. So, I've been thinking about this for a while, or maybe the past year, about the way in which I've judged people and how those judgments more so affect me and my character as opposed to what they say about the actual person, right? And I'm curious what you think about letting go of judgment and just being more accepting of people in general, like people that are close to you, or what are your thoughts on that?
I'm not sure. I do think there's a tremendous degree of corruption in human nature, and to try to hide from that, I think is almost like running away from one's shadow. I guess I'd have to say that's an area of deep questioning for me right now. Most of our spiritual and therapeutic culture tells us to suspend judgment, and I think there are benefits that come from that. And it's possible that the suspension of that kind of judgment or the refusal to get caught in a track of retrograde thinking, like where I might be rerunning a grudge or rerunning fears I have or something of that nature, that is probably a barrier to accessing or selecting some of the things that we want in life from a metaphysical perspective. So there's good reason to not get caught on that kind of retro track. As far as people's nature goes, the older I get, the fewer and fewer people as a fraction of the human population, I think there are, who really make an effort towards reciprocity, empathy, payment of debt on the fullest scale. I have known nice things to say about human nature, and for that reason, it's probably not a bad idea for people to be careful about their social circles, be careful not to get hurt, be careful not to put yourself in a situation where you're going to be caught in the crossfire of the human situation. So I'm not going to suggest that there's not accuracy perhaps in a person's judgments, depending on circumstance and individual, but probably it does help with one's aims to not get caught on those tracks. And I think there's a metaphysical component to that.
Mm-hmm. I agree. So, do you have any final thoughts or any?
I'm grateful to do it, man. It's great to have you here. I love your listenership. I think it's one of the best listenerships online. So I'm glad to be able to share these ideas.
Thanks,
I was touched by something the other day. I was watching some videos of Grant Morrison and Alan Moore, both authors who are very deeply steeped in magic, and I was very turned on by something. I noticed that these dudes were going on channels that were maybe dedicated to the occult or dedicated to magic, and they weren't the usual kind of, how can I put this? They weren't the usual, like, big top 10 up in lights, podcasts like Joe Rogan or whatever. And I'm sure, guys of that level of fame have entry to those places, but they elected to go to channels where they thought their public was, their closest audience members were, or their colleagues were. And I just so fucking respect that, and it means the world to me that we could have this conversation, coming from a place with similar values. And
me too, yeah.
Your listeners, whether they agree or disagree, I mean, there should be all kinds of agreements and disagreements. Why would it be otherwise? They have a place of similar values, which is values of the search. And that's what I really dig.
Well, no, I mean, to your point, and I really appreciate you saying that. I really think that energy attracts energy, and to be very conscious of that. I mean, obviously, I can't control who listens to this podcast, but I think that if people are listening to this podcast, it's for a specific reason, and if they continue to listen to it, it's for a specific reason, right? So, I appreciate you for saying that.
Yeah. Back at you.
Cool.
Back at you.
Thanks for doing this, man.
Pleasure.
Appreciate it.
All right,
man.
All right.
Music for the podcast is by Rarebit, aka Justin Dosher Hopkins. YouTube and creative support is by Tyler Scully. Thanks so much for tuning in, and see you next time.